I'm 29, and I've been waiting 15 years for this exact moment. Easter Sunday. My dad Bradley's house, the same house I grew up in before Samantha moved in, and systematically erased every trace of my existence from it. I showed up with store-bought rolls because I stopped pretending to care about impressing these people around age 23. My stepbrother Brent was already there with his usual smirk, wearing a polo that probably cost more than my car payment, and Samantha had that tight smile she gets when she's about to say something nasty but wants to look civilized doing it. The table was set with the good china, which should have been my first clue something was wrong. Samantha only breaks out the good stuff when she's performing for someone or about to manipulate someone. We made it through about 6 minutes of small talk before my dad cleared his throat in that way he does when he's about to make a pronouncement he expects everyone to just accept. Brent's business failed. Some consultant firm he started 3 years ago that was supposed to make him a millionaire by 30. Dad had been bragging about it at every family gathering, telling anyone who'd listen how brilliant his oldest son was, how Brent had the Midas touch, how he was building an empire. I'd just nod and drink my beer and think about how none of them had asked about my job in actual years. Dad slammed his fist on the table hard enough to make the silverware jump. You're paying his debts now. $80,000. This isn't a discussion. This is what's happening. We already promised his creditors you'd cover it. I just sat there holding my fork, a piece of ham halfway to my mouth, trying to process what I'd just heard. I asked him to repeat himself because surely I'd misheard. Samantha leaned forward with this sneer on her face that I've seen directed at me for 15 years. She said I owed them for tolerating me all these years, called me an ungrateful parasite, told me to pay up or get out forever. Her voice had this edge to it like she'd been storing up all this venom and finally had permission to spit it at me. Brent smirked and said finally I'd be contributing something besides disappointment. That's when something clicked in my head. Not rage exactly, more like clarity. I'd been the family punching bag since I was 14 years old when Dad married Samantha, 6 months after my mom died. 14. I was barely a teenager and suddenly I had this woman in my house telling me I was too loud, too messy, too much of a reminder of Bradley's past life. Brent was 16 and made it his personal mission to remind me daily that this was his mom's house now, and I was just living in it by charity. Every achievement I had was minimized. Made Dean's List in college? That's nice, dear. Brent got promoted to team lead. Got my first real job? How sweet. Brent is starting his own company. Bought my own condo. Cool. Anyway, here's another story about Brent's networking wins. I'd spent 15 years being erased, being tolerated, being treated like the unwanted stepchild in my own father's house. And the whole time I'd been documenting and preparing and waiting. Dad added that they'd already promised his creditors. My savings account? They wanted me to hand it over right now. He actually said now in that tone, like I was still 14 and he could ground me. I started laughing. Not a little chuckle either, I full-on laughed until tears ran down my face. Samantha's face went red, and she started screeching about respect. Dad stood up and demanded to know what was funny. Brent looked confused for maybe the first time in his life. I stood up still laughing and told them this was the most absurd thing I'd ever heard. I asked Dad if he'd lost his mind. I asked Samantha if she genuinely thought I'd hand over 80 grand to bail out her failure of a son. I looked at Brent and asked him how it felt knowing his mommy and her husband had to beg the family disappointment to save him. Then I walked out. Just left my jacket, left the ham, left everything, and walked straight to my car while they screamed behind me. Dad was yelling about family obligation. Samantha was saying something about cutting me off. Brent called me a selfish piece of garbage. I drove home, poured myself a whiskey, and waited. The call started within 2 hours. First Dad, then Samantha, then Brent, then all three of them in rotation. By midnight, I had 63 missed calls, and my phone was blowing up with texts that ranged from demanding to threatening to completely unhinged. The accounts are frozen. How do you know about that? Call me right now. What did you do? I didn't respond to any of them. I just sat there reading the messages, watching them spiral into panic, and felt absolutely nothing except satisfaction. Here's what they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to find out because they were too busy dismissing me as the family disappointment. 6 years ago, when I was 23 and Dad was doing his estate planning, he put my name on several family accounts. Joint ownership. He said it was for emergencies, for estate purposes, in case anything happened to him. At the time, I was still trying to be a good son, still trying to win his approval, so I signed whatever he asked. Those accounts had been sitting there for 6 years. I'd never touched them, never even looked at the balances because I didn't need to. I had my own money, my own life, my own finances completely separate from them. But I always knew they were there. And 2 months ago, when Brent's business started publicly falling apart and I started hearing through extended family that he owed serious money, I made some moves. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. I just went to the bank, showed my ID and my joint account ownership, and set up some new authentication requirements, added security features, made it so any large withdrawal would require both account holders present with ID. I didn't freeze anything. I didn't steal anything. I just made sure no one could access those accounts without me physically being there to authorize it. They were counting on that money. Dad had apparently promised Brent's creditors that the debt would be covered from family assets. Samantha had been telling people they had it handled. Brent had been buying time by saying the money was coming, and now they couldn't access a dollar without my signature. The texts kept coming through the night. Dad saying I was destroying the family. Samantha calling me every name she could think of. Brent begging and threatening in the same message. I read every single one while drinking my whiskey and feeling absolutely vindicated. Because here's the thing they never understood. I didn't spend 15 years being dismissed and degraded and tolerating it because I was weak or stupid or because I didn't have options. I spent 15 years watching and learning and understanding exactly who these people were. I watched how they treated anyone they thought was beneath them. I watched how they used people. I watched how they threw money around when things were good and expected others to clean up their messes when things went bad. And I waited for them to overstep so badly that there would be no coming back from it. Waited for them to show their true faces so clearly that even they couldn't pretend anymore. Demanding $80,000 from me to cover Brent's failed business? That was the overstep. That was them finally revealing exactly how much contempt they had for me, how little they valued me as a human being, how completely they saw me as just a resource to exploit. My phone rang again. Dad. I let it go to voicemail. Then Samantha. Then Brent again. I have work tomorrow. My actual job that none of them ever ask about. Where I'm actually respected. Where I've been building my career while they've been treating me like garbage at family dinners. I'm not answering their calls. I'm not unfreezing anything. I'm not having a conversation about family obligation with people who've made it crystal clear I was never really family to them. And honestly, I've never felt better. Update 1. So it's been 4 days since Easter and this situation has gone completely sideways in ways I didn't even anticipate. First, let me address some comments because a few of you called this perfectly. Yes, they showed up at my workplace. Yes, extended family got involved. And yes, it turns out their financial situation is way worse than just Brent's failed business. Buckle up, because this gets messy. Monday morning, I'm at my desk trying to focus on a project deadline. When our receptionist calls my extension, she tells me my father is in the lobby demanding to see me. I check the time. 9:47 a.m. on a Monday. My dad, who always made a big deal about how busy and important his schedule was, drove 40 minutes to my office in the middle of a workday. I went down there because honestly I wanted to see this. Dad was standing by the reception desk in khakis and a button-down, looking like he'd aged 5 years since Easter. He started in immediately about how we needed to talk, how I was being unreasonable, how family doesn't treat family like this. I told him he needed to leave. This was my workplace, and he couldn't just show up making demands. He raised his voice. People in the lobby turned to look. He said I'd put my own father in an impossible position, that Brent's creditors were calling every day, that I was destroying everything out of spite. His face was red, and he was doing that thing where he jabs his finger in the air when he's trying to intimidate someone. I kept my voice level and told him I'd added standard security features to accounts I was legally authorized to manage. I hadn't touched his money, hadn't frozen anything that was solely his. If he needed access to joint accounts, he could make an appointment at the bank and we could both go. Together. Like the account terms required. He demanded to know when. I told him I'd check my schedule and get back to him. Maybe next month. That's when he lost it. Started yelling about how I was punishing him for marrying Samantha, how I'd never accepted his new family, how I'd been difficult and resentful since I was 14. Our receptionist picked up the phone and I knew she was calling security. I let him rant for about 30 seconds before cutting him off. I asked him if he remembered what he said to me when I was 17 and got accepted into college with a partial scholarship. He looked confused. I reminded him. He'd told me it was nice, but Brent was already in college doing real things, and I should probably consider community college to save money. I asked if he remembered when I graduated college, and he missed my graduation because Brent had a minor outpatient procedure the same day. I asked if he remembered the last time he'd asked about my job, my life, anything about me that wasn't connected to what I could do for his other family. Security arrived. 2 guys in uniform. My dad looked at them, looked at me, and told me I'd regret this. that I was making a huge mistake. That family was everything, and I was throwing it away. I walked back to my office without responding. The calls didn't stop. If anything, they increased. Brent called me 7 times on Monday alone. Samantha left voicemails that started out syrupy sweet. "Honey, we need to talk about this misunderstanding," and devolved into her screeching about what an ungrateful snake I was. Dad alternated between trying to sound authoritative and almost pleading. I didn't answer any of them. Tuesday afternoon, my Uncle Omar called. My dad's older brother lives about 2 hours away. We're not close, but we're not hostile either. He usually shows up to major holidays, and we have perfectly pleasant surface-level conversations. He asked if I had a few minutes to talk. I said sure. He asked what was going on with my dad because Bradley had called him asking to borrow $30,000. Said it was an emergency, a temporary cash flow issue, would pay him back within 3 months. I asked Omar if Dad had mentioned what the emergency was. Omar said no, just that it was urgent and he was helping Brent through a rough patch. Omar wanted to know if I knew anything about it since Dad had mentioned I was being difficult about some family accounts. This is where it gets interesting. I asked Omar how much he knew about Brent's business. Turns out Omar had lent Brent $15,000 2 years ago to help with startup costs. Brent had told him the business was taking off, showing him projected earnings, talking about expansion plans. Omar had never been paid back, but Brent kept saying it was coming, just needed a few more months. I told Omar the business had failed completely, that Brent owed at least $80,000 to various creditors, that Dad and Samantha had demanded I pay off those debts during Easter dinner and threatened to cut me off when I refused. The line went quiet for a solid 10 seconds. Then Omar asked why they thought I would pay Brent's business debts. I explained the whole situation, the joint accounts, the ambush at Easter, the demands, all of it. Omar said something I hadn't expected. He said this wasn't the first time. 3 years ago, Dad had called him asking to borrow money for home repairs. Omar had sent $5,000. No repairs were ever done. Last year, Samantha had called Omar's wife asking for help with medical bills. Said they were struggling with insurance. Omar's wife had sent $2,000. I did the math out loud. That's $22,000 just from Omar's family. Omar asked if I thought they'd borrowed from other family members too. I said I'd bet money on it. We talked for another 20 minutes. Omar was angry in this quiet, controlled way. He said he'd been helping his younger brother because that's what family does, and now he was finding out he'd been lied to for years. He asked what I was planning to do. I told him the truth. I wasn't planning to give them access to those accounts. I wasn't paying Brent's debts. I wasn't bailing them out. I'd been treated like an obligation and a burden for 15 years, and I was done. Omar was quiet again. Then he said he didn't blame me, that he needed to make some calls to other family members and find out how deep this went. Wednesday morning, Samantha showed up at my condo. I have no idea how she got past the building's front entrance. Probably tailgated behind another resident. She was standing outside my door when I left for work at 7:15 a.m. She tried the soft approach first. Said we needed to talk about this like adults. Said there had been a misunderstanding. Said she knew Easter had been overwhelming, and maybe they'd approached it wrong, but this was about family helping family in crisis. I told her to leave. She blocked my path to the elevator, started talking about how she'd been there for my dad when he was grieving my mom, how she'd tried so hard to make me feel included, how Brent had always looked up to me as a brother. Every word was calculated manipulation, and we both knew it. I asked her point blank how much money they'd borrowed from extended family over the years. Her face changed. She demanded to know who I'd been talking to. I told her I'd talked to Omar, that I knew about the loans that were never paid back. I asked how many other relatives they'd scammed with sob stories and promises to repay. She called me a vindictive little brat. Said I'd always been jealous of Brent, always resentful that my dad had moved on after my mom died, always looking for ways to cause problems. She said I was holding everyone hostage over childhood grudges. I stepped around her and headed for the elevator. She followed me, her voice getting louder. She said Brent's creditors were threatening legal action, that the house might go into foreclosure, that I was destroying my father's life, and for what? Because I felt neglected as a teenager? I turned around, asked her about the house going into foreclosure. She stopped mid-sentence. Her face went blank for just a second before she tried to recover. I asked how Dad's house, the house I grew up in that should have been paid off years ago, could be in foreclosure. She said it was none of my business. I said if they were asking me for $80,000, then their finances were absolutely my business. The elevator arrived. I stepped in. She tried to follow, but I physically moved to block the doorway. I told her if she showed up at my condo or my workplace again, I'd call the police for harassment. The doors closed on her, still talking. I spent Wednesday evening doing something I probably should have done years ago. I pulled up public property records for Dad's house. The house my mom died in. The house that should have been owned free and clear since 2011. They'd refinanced it multiple times. The current mortgage was taken out 18 months ago for $370,000 on a house that's maybe worth $400,000 in this market. They'd pulled every dollar of equity out of that house. The house my mom had helped pay for. The house that was supposed to be my dad's retirement security. I sat there staring at the property records trying to figure out where all that money had gone. Brent's failed business probably ate through a huge chunk, but the rest? Were they just living beyond their means for years, keeping up appearances while drowning in debt? My phone rang. Brent. I answered this time. He started immediately with how I was screwing him over, how I had no idea what kind of pressure he was under, how his creditors were threatening him with legal action and it was my fault. He said the accounts were family money and I had no right to block access. I let him rant for a solid minute. Then I asked him why he thought his failed business was my responsibility. He said it wasn't about responsibility, it was about family supporting family. I asked him when he'd ever supported me, when he'd ever treated me like family instead of like an inconvenience. He said I was twisting things, that him and Samantha had welcomed me, that any issues were in my head because I couldn't accept that Dad had moved on. I asked him how much of the money he'd borrowed from extended family had actually gone into his business versus just funding his lifestyle. He told me to shut up, said I didn't know anything about running a business or taking risks, that I'd always been jealous because he was doing something real while I was just working some nobody desk job. I told him his business failed because he was incompetent and overconfident, that he'd been handed opportunities and money his entire life and still couldn't make it work, that at least I'd built my career without scamming relatives and demanding bailouts. He hung up on me. Thursday morning, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered because I thought it might be work-related. It was one of Brent's creditors, a lawyer representing someone Brent owed $42,000 to. The lawyer said they understood I was a family member who might be in a position to help settle the debt. I asked how they got my number. They said Brent had provided it as a potential additional contact. I told them I wasn't responsible for Brent's debts, and they needed to stop calling me. The lawyer said they weren't suggesting I was legally responsible, but were hoping we could work something out as a family matter. I said no and hung up. 2 more creditors called that afternoon, both with the same story. Brent had given them my contact information and suggested I might be willing to help. He'd literally given my personal phone number to his creditors as a backup payment source. I'm sitting here Thursday night and my phone keeps buzzing with calls from numbers I don't recognize. Extended family is apparently comparing notes about loans they made to Dad and Samantha that were never repaid. Omar called again to tell me my Aunt Kira had lent them $12,000 last year for car repairs. My cousin Imogen had been paying for Brent's professional memberships because he said he was cash poor while building the business. The total from extended family alone is probably close to $50,000 in loans that were never paid back, and they had the audacity to demand $80,000 from me. Tomorrow, I'm going to the bank to remove myself as joint account holder on any accounts where that's possible. For the ones where I can't remove myself, I'm going to have them put in writing exactly what documentation is required for withdrawals. Every single detail in writing. Dad keeps calling. Samantha keeps calling. Brent keeps calling. I'm not answering. Let them panic. Update 2. It's been a week and a half since my last update, and the situation has evolved into something I didn't fully anticipate. The extended family situation has blown up in spectacular fashion. Dad and Samantha have tried approximately 6 different manipulation strategies, and I've learned exactly why Samantha has hated me for 15 years. Also, Brent is apparently considering bankruptcy, which has sent everyone into full panic mode. Friday morning, I went to the bank like I said I would. Spent 2 hours with a manager going through every account where my name appeared. Turns out Dad had put me on more accounts than I even knew about. There was a savings account, 2 checking accounts, and some kind of money market account. Total across all of them was around $240,000. I couldn't remove myself as joint owner without Dad's signature. But I could and did have the bank document in writing that any withdrawal over $500 required both account holders present with valid ID and verbal authorization. The manager printed everything out, made me sign acknowledgments, put notes in the system. She asked if there was a family dispute, and I told her yes. There was a significant dispute about finances, and I needed to protect my interests. The bank manager was professional, but I could tell she'd seen this before. She made sure everything was documented 6 ways to Sunday. I left the bank and went to a lawyer's office. Nothing dramatic, just a consultation about my liability in this situation. The lawyer confirmed what I already knew. I had no legal obligation to pay Brent's business debts. The joint accounts were legal, and my actions were within my rights as an account holder. He suggested I get everything in writing regarding any communications about the debts and keep detailed records. That afternoon, Dad called from a different number. I answered because I didn't recognize it. He sounded exhausted, asked if we could please just meet somewhere and talk like adults. Said he understood I was angry, but this wasn't solving anything. He suggested we meet for lunch on Saturday. I agreed. I wanted to hear what approach they were going to try next. Saturday, I drove to a diner about halfway between our places. Dad was already there in a booth looking like he'd aged another 5 years. No Samantha, no Brent, just him. He ordered coffee and didn't touch it. Started talking about how he knew he hadn't been the best father after my mom died. Said he'd been grieving and maybe hadn't paid enough attention to what I needed. Said marrying Samantha so quickly had probably been a mistake in terms of timing, but he'd been lonely and she'd been there. I sat there and let him talk. Watched him try to frame 15 years of neglect and favoritism as understandable mistakes made during grief. He said Brent's business failing wasn't about me, that Brent had made bad decisions and gotten in over his head. That yes, they'd borrowed money from family, but they'd always intended to pay it back. Things had just gotten away from them financially. The house refinancing had been necessary to help Brent with startup costs and to cover some medical expenses Samantha had a few years ago. I asked what medical expenses. Dad hesitated. Said Samantha had some procedures done that weren't fully covered by insurance. I asked him point blank if they'd taken out $370,000 in loans against the house and blown through all of it in less than 2 years. Said she knew we'd never gotten along, but she wanted to explain some things. She asked if I knew why she'd been so hard on me when I was younger. I said because she wanted me gone so she could have Dad all to herself with her perfect son. She said that wasn't it at all. She said when she married Dad, I looked exactly like my mother. Same hair color, same facial structure, same mannerisms. She said every time she looked at me, she saw Dad's dead wife staring back at her. That it had been painful and difficult, and she'd handled it badly. I asked if she wanted sympathy for treating a grieving 14-year-old like garbage because I reminded her of the woman whose husband she married 6 months after she died. She said she was trying to explain, not excuse, that she knew she'd made mistakes, that she wanted to clear the air so we could move forward. I asked what moving forward looked like to her. She said we could be adults about this, that we could work together as a family to solve the current crisis. I told her the current crisis was entirely of their own making. She said that wasn't fair, that Brent had taken a risk starting his business and sometimes risks don't work out, that they'd supported him because that's what parents do. I asked if she'd supported me that way when I was in college working 2 jobs to cover what my partial scholarship didn't. She said that was different because I'd never asked for help. I reminded her that I'd asked for help with textbook costs my sophomore year, and she'd told Dad I needed to learn financial responsibility. She went quiet, then said I'd always been so independent and self-sufficient that she'd thought I didn't need help. I said maybe I'd been independent because I'd learned early that I couldn't depend on any of them. She said this was exactly the problem, that I'd decided they were the enemy when I was a teenager and had spent 15 years looking for evidence to support that narrative, that I'd never given her or Brent a real chance. I asked about the money they'd borrowed from extended family. She said they'd hit some rough patches and family had helped, that they were working on paying everyone back. I asked when they'd planned to start since none of them had seen $1 in repayment. She said I was being hostile, that she was trying to have an honest conversation and I was attacking her. I said she'd called me asking for $80,000 and now wanted credit for having an honest conversation. She switched tactics again, said Brent was talking about bankruptcy, that it would destroy his credit for years, that he was only 32 and this would follow him forever. She asked if I wanted to be responsible for ruining his future. I said Brent ruined his own future by running a business incompetently and borrowing money he couldn't pay back. She said I was jealous, that I'd always been jealous because Brent was confident and ambitious, while I played it safe with a regular job. I said Brent was confident because he'd never faced real consequences for anything in his life, that he'd been bailed out and coddled and told he was brilliant when he was actually just reckless. She told me I didn't know what I was talking about. I asked her how much of that $370,000 from the house refinancing had actually gone to Brent's business versus funding their lifestyle. She said that was none of my business. I said she'd made it my business when she demanded I pay for their mistakes. She started crying, said I was cruel and hateful, that she'd tried so hard with me and I'd rejected every attempt, that she'd wanted us to be a family, but I'd been determined to hate her from day one. I told her she'd thrown away my mother's belongings within a year of moving in, that she'd made it clear I was a reminder of an unwanted past, That she'd spent 15 years making sure I knew Brent was the real son, and I was just Bradley's obligation. She said that wasn't true. I asked her to name one time in 15 years she'd treated me the same way she treated Brent. One time she'd supported me or been proud of me or done anything that suggested she saw me as anything other than an inconvenience. She couldn't. The line went quiet for probably 30 seconds. Then she said this was pointless, that I'd made up my mind to punish them and nothing she said would change that. I said she was right about that. She hung up. Monday afternoon, Omar called again, said he'd talked to 4 other relatives and the total borrowed was actually closer to $70,000, not 50. That Dad had apparently been borrowing from different people for years, with stories about emergencies and temporary cash shortages. That everyone had believed him because you don't expect your brother or cousin to be running a years-long scam. Omar said several relatives were planning to confront Dad together, that they wanted to know where the money went and when they could expect repayment. He asked if I wanted to be there. I said no, that this was between them, and I didn't want to be part of that conversation. Omar said he understood, but wanted me to know that nobody blamed me for cutting them off. That if anything, they all felt stupid for not seeing the pattern sooner. Tuesday, Brent showed up at my gym. I don't know how he knew I'd be there, but he was waiting by my car when I came out around 7 p.m. He looked rough, needed a shave, bags under his eyes, wearing gym clothes, but clearly hadn't worked out. He said we needed to talk. I unlocked my car. He said he wasn't leaving until I heard him out. I told him he had 5 minutes. He said the creditor threats were getting serious, that one of them had filed paperwork to start legal proceedings, that his credit was already destroyed and bankruptcy was looking like the only option. He said this wasn't just about money anymore, it was about his entire future. I asked whose fault that was. He said I was being petty, that I was punishing him for things that happened when we were teenagers. I said I was protecting myself from being exploited by people who saw me as a resource. He said we were brothers. I said we weren't brothers. We were 2 people who'd been forced to live in the same house for 4 years when I was a teenager. That he'd spent those 4 years making sure I knew he was the important one and I was just taking up space. He said that was kid stuff, that we'd both been immature, that he'd grown up and I should too. I asked when he'd grown up exactly. Was it before or after he failed at running a business? Before or after he'd borrowed tens of thousands from family with no plan to repay it? Before or after he gave my phone number to his creditors? His face went red. He said the creditors thing was Mom's idea, that she'd thought maybe if I understood how serious this was, I'd help. I said all it did was confirm that none of them saw me as a person, just as a potential source of money. He said I was acting like they'd abused me or something, that I'd had a normal childhood and was inventing trauma to justify being selfish. I asked if he remembered the time he and Samantha convinced Dad to cancel my birthday dinner when I was 16, because Brent had a date he didn't want to miss. He said he didn't remember that. I asked if he remembered telling me when I was 17 that I should just go live with relatives because I was making everyone uncomfortable by moping about my dead mom. He said I was exaggerating again. I told him to move away from my car. He said he wasn't done. I told him I was done, and if he didn't move, I'd call the police. He said I was really going to call the cops on my own brother. I pulled out my phone. He moved, called me a selfish piece of work and walked away. I sat in my car for a few minutes, just breathing. The entitlement was astounding. Every single one of them genuinely believed they deserved my money because we were technically family. Wednesday, Omar called with an update. He and 3 other relatives had confronted Dad. It had not gone well. Dad had tried to justify every loan by saying they'd been going through hard times. When pressed about repayment, he'd said the money was needed for Brent's business and they'd be paid back once things stabilized. When they pointed out the business had failed, he'd gotten defensive and said they were ganging up on him during a crisis. Samantha had apparently been there and had spent most of the confrontation crying and saying they didn't understand the pressure they were under, that they'd been trying to help Brent succeed and everything had gone wrong, that the family should be supporting them, not attacking them. Omar said he'd told them point blank that the $70,000 borrowed from family needed to be repaid, that they expected a payment plan in writing within 2 weeks. Dad had said that was impossible, that they were barely making minimum payments on everything as it was. That's when Omar had asked about the house refinancing. Where had $370,000 gone? Dad had said that was none of their business. Omar had said when you borrow money from family and don't pay it back, your finances become their business. The meeting had ended with Dad and Samantha leaving. No payment plan, no acknowledgement of responsibility, just excuses and deflection. It's Wednesday night now, and I'm getting calls from numbers I don't recognize at least twice a day. Brent's creditors. My phone stays on silent. The extended family situation is fracturing. Some relatives are angry at Dad. Some think I should help anyway because family. Some are staying out of it entirely, and honestly, I'm sleeping better than I have in years. They wanted to treat me like an ATM, like my only purpose was to bail out their mistakes. And now they're finding out what happens when the ATM says no. Final update. It's been 3 weeks since Easter, and this whole situation has reached what I think is its conclusion. The house is in foreclosure. Brent filed for bankruptcy last week, and I had one final confrontation with all three of them that made everything crystal clear. Also, the extended family situation has gotten nuclear in ways that honestly surprised even me. I'll start with last Thursday. I was leaving work around 6 when I saw Dad's car in the parking lot. He was leaning against it waiting for me. Before I could say anything, he put his hands up and said he just wanted 5 minutes, that he wasn't there to argue or make demands. I stopped about 10 feet away, told him he had 5 minutes. He looked terrible, like he'd aged a decade in 3 weeks. He said the bank had started foreclosure proceedings on the house, that they'd missed 2 payments and the bank wouldn't negotiate anymore. He said they had maybe 60 days before they'd be forced out. I didn't say anything, just waited. He said he'd spent the last week looking at apartments and they couldn't afford anything decent on his pension and Samantha's part-time income, that they'd be looking at a small 2-bedroom in a bad part of town. He said this in a way that suggested I should feel bad about it. I asked what he wanted from me. He said he wanted me to understand what my actions had caused, that because I was holding the accounts hostage, they couldn't access money that was legally his, that they were losing the house my mother had lived in because I was being vindictive. I told him the money in those accounts was the only thing keeping me from being financially responsible if they somehow tried to claim I'd promised to help, that my name on those accounts meant I had every right to protect myself, that the house situation was the result of them borrowing $370,000 and blowing through it. He said I was missing the point, that they were family, and family helped each other. I asked when they'd ever helped me. He said he'd raised me and that counted for something. I asked if he remembered my college graduation. He said of course he did. I told him he'd left after an hour because Samantha wanted to go to some outlet mall sale, that he'd missed the ceremony where I got an award for my senior thesis because he was shopping for discounted kitchen appliances. He said I was bringing up minor things from years ago. I said those minor things added up to 15 years of being treated like I didn't matter. He said I was determined to see myself as a victim. I asked about the $70,000 he'd borrowed from extended family. He said that was being handled. I asked how it was being handled when he couldn't make his house payment. He said they'd work something out eventually. I told him there was no eventually, that Omar and the others wanted a payment plan in writing or they were considering legal action. His face went pale. He asked if I'd put them up to that. I said I hadn't needed to because they were adults who had figured out they'd been scammed. He said scammed was a strong word, that he'd borrowed money during hard times and intended to pay it back. I asked when, in the last 5 years, he'd made a single payment to anyone he'd borrowed from. He said things had been tight. I said things had been tight because they'd been living beyond their means while using family members as an ATM. He tried a different approach, said Brent was his son and he'd been trying to help him succeed, that any father would do the same. I said any father would also not throw their other son away to do it. He said he'd never thrown me away. I asked when he'd last called me just to talk, when he'd last asked about my life, when he'd last treated me like someone he actually wanted in his life versus someone he was obligated to acknowledge. He couldn't answer, just stood there looking tired and defeated. I asked if Samantha knew he was here. He said no, that she'd told him not to bother because I'd made my position clear. I asked what Brent thought. He said Brent was too busy dealing with the bankruptcy lawyer to care about anything else. I told him I was removing myself from any remaining accounts, that I'd already started the paperwork, that within 2 weeks there would be no financial connection between us whatsoever. He asked what he was supposed to do then. I said he'd figure it out the same way everyone else who doesn't have a backup ATM figures it out. He said I was angry, and that was understandable, but I'd regret this someday. That family was all you had in the end. I said family was supposed to care about you and support you and treat you like you mattered. That what we had wasn't family, it was just people related by blood and marriage who'd used me whenever convenient. He got back in his car without another word. I watched him drive away and felt absolutely nothing. Saturday, Omar called. Said he and 5 other relatives had sent Dad a formal letter demanding repayment of the $70,000 within 90 days, or they'd pursue legal action. That they'd pooled money for a lawyer who'd looked at all the loans and confirmed they had a case for fraud if they wanted to pursue it. I asked if they were actually going to sue. Omar said probably not because it would cost more than they'd recover. But the letter made it clear they were serious and that Dad couldn't just ignore them. He said 2 relatives had already filed disputes with their credit cards claiming the money had been borrowed under false pretenses. Omar also said word had spread through the extended family that Dad and Samantha were effectively cut off from everyone, No one was taking their calls. No one was willing to help. The family consensus was that they'd been running a scam for years and everyone was done. I asked about Thanksgiving since that was coming up in several months. Omar laughed and said Dad and Samantha weren't invited to any family gatherings anymore. That his invitation to the usual family Thanksgiving had been explicitly rescinded. That they'd burned every bridge and now had to deal with being isolated. Sunday afternoon, all three of them showed up at my condo building. I was coming back from the grocery store and they were standing in the lobby. Building security was already there asking them to leave. I told security it was fine, and I'd handle it. We went outside to the parking lot. Samantha immediately started in about how I was destroying the family. That we could still fix this if I just listened. That they'd worked out a plan. I asked what plan. Brent said if I released the accounts, they could access enough money to save the house and make a payment arrangement with his creditors. That the bankruptcy could be stopped if they had access to capital. I asked how much was in the accounts. Dad said around $240,000. I asked how $80,000 of that was supposed to cover Brent's debts and save a house that was $370,000 underwater. Brent said they'd figure out the details, but they needed access first. I said no. Samantha asked what it would take. What did I want from them to let this go? I said there was nothing they could offer because this wasn't a negotiation, that I was protecting my interests, and they needed to deal with their situation without expecting me to fund it. Samantha said I was being cruel, that I'd always been resentful and bitter, and now I was finally getting my revenge. I said she was right about the revenge part, that I'd been waiting for them to overstep so badly that I'd have justification to cut them off completely. That Easter dinner had given me exactly what I needed. Dad said I was admitting this was about vindictiveness, not protection. I said it was about both, that I was protecting myself from people who'd proven they saw me as a resource to exploit. And yes, I was also enjoying watching them face consequences for their decisions. Brent called me a petty asshole, said I was destroying his life over childhood grudges. I asked how his creditors were doing, if they were still calling. He told me to shut up. I asked if bankruptcy was as bad as he'd thought it would be. He took a step toward me, and Dad grabbed his arm. Samantha tried one more time, said she was sorry for how she'd treated me when I was younger, that she'd been wrong to throw away my mom's things and make me feel unwelcome, that she wanted to make it right. I asked if she'd been planning to apologize before they needed money or if the apology only came after I had something they wanted. Her face went hard. She said I was going to regret this, that they were going to lose everything because of me and I'd have to live with that. I said they were losing everything because of their own choices and I'd sleep fine. Dad said one day I'd understand what it meant to sacrifice for family. I said I already understood sacrifice. I'd sacrificed my relationship with my father for 15 years trying to earn his approval while he chose his new family over me every single time. That he'd taught me exactly how family works, and now he was upset I'd learned the lesson too well. Security came back out and asked if everything was okay. I said they were leaving. Dad said we weren't done. I said we were completely done, and if they showed up at my home or work again, I'd file harassment charges. I went inside. They stayed in the parking lot for another 10 minutes before leaving. Monday, I went back to the bank and completed the process of removing myself from the joint accounts. It required Dad's signature, which I obviously didn't have, so instead I closed my authorization for any future transactions. The bank manager explained that this meant the accounts were essentially frozen until both parties could come to an agreement or court ordered otherwise. I signed everything. The accounts are locked. They can't access the money without a lengthy legal process that would cost more than they'd recover. And I'm no longer liable for anything they might try to do with those accounts. Tuesday, Omar called again with news that Dad and Samantha had listed the house for sale. They were trying to sell it before the foreclosure completed to at least avoid that on their credit. The asking price was barely above what they owed. They'd get maybe $30,000 out of it if it sold quickly. Wednesday, Brent's bankruptcy filing became official. I looked it up in the public records. He'd listed over $90,000 in debt. His credit score would be destroyed for years. The business was officially dissolved. His LinkedIn profile still said CEO and founder, like that meant something. Thursday, I blocked all their numbers. Dad's, Samantha's, Brent's. Also blocked them on every social media platform. Cut off every possible method of contact except formal mail.